Today we're starting a new series that might make us all a bit uncomfortable. And don't worry, it's not an awkward or weird topic like sex or dating, but it is a very real topic. We're going to talk about science and faith. Now, at best, science and faith can seem like frenemies. At worst, though, they can seem like there's no way they'd actually get along. Because the reality is that science and faith can feel worlds apart, like they're two areas that can't possibly coexist. Maybe you've sat in science class and learned things about life and the earth or humanity that left you doubting your faith. Maybe you've wondered, does evolution prove that God isn't real? Does scientific discovery discredit spirituality? Does scientific evidence prove that some Bible stories didn't happen the way we think they did? Now, if we're all being honest, this might be the big question. Can we believe science and still have faith in God? Now let's be real. Doesn't it feel like we have to choose between science and faith? Maybe you've heard a parent or a relative or someone at church tell you to be careful with what you learn in science class at school. Yet when you read your textbook or listen to your teacher, it's hard to argue with what science has proven to be true. Whether you've ever talked about it out loud or not, I would guess we've all felt this tension that seems to exist between science and faith. And often it seems like science is trying to disprove God. And if that's true, God must disapprove of science, right? So you and I are left feeling like we have to choose between our faith in God and scientific facts and theories. But while this is a very real conflict, did you know it wasn't always this way? For a long time, as scientific theory and exploration was developing, science and faith were not considered to be at odds. In fact, many of the greatest scientists in history didn't have to choose between faith and science. Many of them were actually Christians. In the 1400s, a man named Copernicus taught humanity about the stars and the universe based on his scientific discoveries. He's the person who first recognized that the Earth revolves around the sun instead of the assumption that the sun and planets revolved around the Earth. And he was a Christian. A century later, in the 1500s, Galileo made even more discoveries. Chances are you've learned about him in history or science class. He's the father of science. Now, what you may not have learned is that he too was a Christian. And then in the 1600s and 1700s, Sir Isaac Newton formed some of the most important laws of physics that have since shaped human understanding of how things work. Those laws are still in your science textbooks. And Sir Isaac, Christian. And in the 1800s and 1900s, William Kelvin discovered a ton about the way heat and temperature work. You may know this from your chemistry class. Yeah, the same Kelvin who's the reason why we use a Kelvin scale to this day, he was also a Christian. Do you see a pattern here? See, for centuries, some of the greatest scientists in history didn't seem to choose between belief in God and belief in science. So why does it seem like we have to make that choice today? For some reason, the 21st century convinced all of us to believe that Christians are afraid of science and that science is just too rational to line up with faith in an invisible God. And this puts you and me in a really tough spot. But what if it doesn't have to be this way? What if you could be really interested in and okay with science and still hold on to your faith? What if science and faith actually relate? What if science doesn't necessarily disprove God? What if God is actually okay with science? Let's talk about it. Now here's the thing. Much of the apparent disconnect between science and faith is related to how things work. As more scientific discoveries are made, we learn more about how the world works. And the more things are explained, the less it seems like we actually need God. The less likely we need to embrace the fact that God is even real. Over time, as science focused on how things work, mystery about the universe decreased. And for some, that made it feel like God was less important. But the difference between science and faith is that faith isn't trying to explain how. Faith is about understanding who was behind it all. Science and faith have different goals, but most of us don't realize that. We assume that they're doing the same thing, which is why when you sit in science class and only the how is mentioned, you might feel the pressure of having to choose between the how of science and the who of your faith. But it doesn't have to be this way. Copernicus, Galileo, Newton, and Kelvin didn't have to choose. And guess what? Neither do you. See, as we begin this series on the relationship between faith and science, we have to take a minute and talk about who is behind everything in our universe. This is actually the exact place where the Bible starts. The Bible is a book full of historical stories and personal experiences from people who believed in and trusted God. In the first book of the Bible, most likely written by a man named Moses, the way the world came to be is explained. Here's how he starts the story of creation. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, I know some of you are thinking, really? Come on, this proves nothing. This is the exact kind of stuff my science textbook would say is ridiculous. You expect me to think that science and faith can actually relate because of some ancient story that doesn't even really explain anything about how everything came to be? And I get it. But the Bible takes a different look at the beginning. A look that focuses on who, not how. As a result, there's been a lot of debate about how God created everything. And this conversation has led some people to attempts to discredit God's existence. However, Genesis wasn't just talking about how. The beginning of the Bible is more about who created everything than how it was all created. The job of science is to explain how it was all done. Now, although science does a great job with these explanations, its experiments, discoveries, and theories cannot answer one of humanity's greatest questions. Did all of this happen by chance? We've all wrestled with and wondered if we're just here by accident. Well, that's where Genesis comes in. The first sentence of the Bible is there to remind us that there is a God who set all of creation into motion. No matter how much we discover about how the universe works, it doesn't mean we have to ignore who is behind it all. What if the purpose of science isn't to disprove God, but instead to teach us more about how He works? What if science actually teaches us how the who behind creation put everything together? What if God and science don't have to be worlds apart? What if the account of creation recorded in Genesis simply shows us that everything science explains isn't by chance, but by design? You still skeptical? That's okay. Just think about this for a second. Did you know that the Earth is in the perfect position to sustain our lives? It's rotating at the perfect speed and orbiting the sun at the perfect velocity to keep gravity in place and us stuck to its surface. It's also at the perfect distance and tilted at the perfect angle to keep us safe from the sun's rays. If there were just slight adjustments to the Earth's angle, speed, or distance from the sun, human life, all life for that matter, would cease to exist. Now, maybe that was a perfect accident, but I have to be honest with you, I don't buy it. I just can't bring myself to believe that the perfect placement of the Earth and sun happened by random chance. I feel the same way about most things in creation. And that's why I love Genesis. It confirms what I was already suspecting. Creation isn't random. There's a who behind our existence. And you can believe in Him while still exploring the how that science explains. This is why we should embrace both the how and the who. If we treat them as though they're enemies, we're missing out on the beauty of both. If we think we can't pay attention to the how of science, we miss the opportunity to learn more about the who behind it all. If we ignore the who, we miss the purpose and significance of the how. Science and faith actually build each other up. Science can help strengthen your faith in God, while God can use science to help you understand His work. In other words, science and faith can exist in the same space. Now, I realize that this might be a different approach than you were expecting to hear in church. Maybe you grew up thinking that faith in God means you have to ignore or discredit science. Maybe you didn't even grow up in church, but one of your hesitations in taking God seriously is your perception that church is old school when it comes to science or how the world works. Well, the good news is that you don't have to choose one or the other. Science and faith can go hand in hand. So how does that work? Well, instead of treating them like they're worlds apart, we can allow them to share the same space. When you go back to science class this week, here's a step you can take. You can put science and faith in their proper place. And because you're clear on the who, you should explore the how. If you have any faith or trust that God exists or any belief that He might be out there, then it's worth exploring how everything works. And as you learn about how, remember who. As you sit in chemistry or biology or physics or environmental science and you learn the intricacies of how the universe works, remember who was behind it all and praise Him for His work. When you begin to do this, you might just be blown away by God's power and creativity. Even if you're unsure about God right now, you might begin to grow in confidence of the who when you take time to discover the how. This should be your approach to both science and faith. When you explore science with the belief that God is behind creation, then your response to science can be, so that's how he did it. Your faith can actually grow as you explore science. This approach puts science and faith both in their proper place. Imagine if people didn't get hung up on the tension between faith and science, but understood how they can work together. As we wrap up, I'm sure some of you are probably still skeptical. You have a million questions and maybe even reasons why all of this can be debated. And if that's you, please hear me. That's okay. This church and your small group leaders are not afraid of your questions. God is not afraid of your questions. All throughout this series, your questions are going to be so important. In fact, we want you to ask them week in and week out. And if you're still skeptical, come back next week. If you struggle to believe there is a who out there behind the how, we're going to talk about it. And before all that, as you head to your group, I want you to think about your answer to this question. What's something you've learned from science that increases your faith in God?